August 1945. Japan had fallen silent. The fires of war that had consumed Asia for nearly a decade finally dimmed, leaving behind only ashes, hunger, and disbelief. The emperor's voice, trembling and distant, echoed through the radios of a broken nation. For many, it was the first time they had ever heard it. "Endure the unendurable," he said. And so they did. But for tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers, nurses, and civilians scattered across the Pacific and Asia, surrender was more than just defeat. It was the end of everything they had been taught to believe. Among them were the forgotten few, Japanese women who, against the strict codes of their empire, found themselves captured by Allied forces. What they expected was torture, humiliation, and death. What they found instead was something that left them speechless. They called it, quietly and with disbelief, a paradise on earth. These were the women of a nation that had been told surrender was worse than death. In the final years of the war, as Japan's territories crumbled one by one, thousands of nurses, clerks, and civilian workers were sent to support the Imperial Army. Many were captured when the tides turned, on the islands of Saipan, Guam, and the Philippines, and later in occupied territories like Burma and New Guinea. They were told by their officers that Americans were demons, that capture meant assault and execution. Mothers hid their children, soldiers clutched grenades, and nurses prepared vials of poison for suicide rather than face dishonor. Yet when the American landing forces arrived, the scenes that followed were far from the horror they had been conditioned to expect. On the island of Saipan in July 1944, as the battle ended in horrific mass suicides along the cliffs, a small group of surviving Japanese women and children were pulled from the rocks by American Marines. Exhausted, starving, and terrified, they braced for cruelty. But instead, they were given food, blankets, and water. One nurse later recalled through tears, "They handed me chocolate. I hadn't tasted sweetness in years. I thought it was a trick." That single act, a simple piece of chocolate, would stay with her for the rest of her life. For the first time, the veil of fear began to lift. The Americans, once painted as monsters, treated them with a compassion they had never imagined possible in war. The U.S. prison camps across the Pacific were not luxurious, but compared to the hellscape Japan had become, they were havens of order, food, and safety. The Geneva Conventions were strictly observed, and American commanders were determined to prove that their moral code was stronger than their enemies' propaganda. The camps were clean, structured, and supplied with medical care. Prisoners were fed regularly, 3 meals a day, often including rice, bread, or meat. For the Japanese POWs, many of whom had starved for months on collapsing front lines, it was surreal. The women were given soap, new clothes, and medical checkups. They were offered writing paper to send messages home through the Red Cross. To many, it was as if they had been transported from one world into another. It was not paradise in the literal sense, but to those who had lived through the brutality of Japan's final days. The hunger, the fear, the indoctrination. It was a peace beyond imagination. They saw American guards laughing, playing cards, sharing cigarettes. They saw enemy soldiers treating them not as beasts or traitors, but as human beings. One captured nurse from the Philippines remembered how an American medic treated her burns after a bombing raid. "He looked at me," she said, "not as a Japanese, but as a woman who was in pain." For someone raised under the banner of total war, that simple humanity was unthinkable. The Americans themselves were shocked by the state of their captives. Many of the women were emaciated, sick, and psychologically broken. They had been told that the United States would execute any Japanese prisoner, especially women. Some even attempted suicide after capture, unable to reconcile their survival with the shame they had been taught. But over time, something began to change. They saw that the guards treated them with respect, and that no one mocked their surrender. Slowly, they began to speak, to smile, to help in the kitchens or tend to the wounded. The walls of fear crumbled, replaced by quiet gratitude. Letters recovered after the war tell stories of awe and confusion. One woman wrote, "We have rice every day. They give us fruit, even milk. The soldiers say good morning and bow. I do not understand this America." Another said simply, "I was captured by angels, not enemies." The contrast with Japan's own treatment of Allied POWs was staggering. Where the Japanese military had inflicted starvation, forced labor, and brutality on captured soldiers, the Americans showed restraint and mercy. This moral inversion left a deep impression on those who survived. When interrogations began, many of the women were hesitant. They had been warned that cooperation meant betrayal. But the Americans, instead of threats, offered comfort. They asked about conditions in Japan, about shortages and morale, and often ended by offering cigarettes or tea. To the Japanese women, it felt unreal, almost embarrassing. The very men they had been taught to despise now treated them better than their own superiors ever had. They began to question everything they had believed about the war, about loyalty, about humanity itself. On the mainland, news of captured Japanese women spread slowly, censored and controlled by the government. Propaganda painted them as shameful traitors, unworthy of return. But within the camps, a quiet revolution of empathy was taking place. The Americans allowed them to teach, to sew, to practice religion. They built gardens, organized language lessons, and even held small celebrations when the war officially ended. For many, it was the first time they had laughed freely in years. One recalled that when she heard jazz music played by the guards at night, she wept, not from sorrow, but from the strange, foreign feeling of peace. As weeks turned into months, the women began to regain their strength. Their cheeks filled out, their eyes regained light. They began helping in the camp hospitals, nursing both American and Japanese wounded side by side. It was there that many realized the truth. The Americans were not gods, nor devils, but men. And in their ordinary kindness, they found redemption for themselves. The prison camps became more than places of confinement. They became sanctuaries where shattered spirits slowly healed. Historians later noted how unique these camps were in the context of the war. The United States, having seen the horrors of Japanese captivity, such as Bataan and Changi, chose to model its own camps as the antithesis of cruelty. It was a deliberate moral statement. For the Japanese women, it was transformative. When repatriation began after the war, many wept as they left. They returned to a nation still ravaged, where food was scarce and shame hung heavy over those who had been captured. But in their hearts, they carried a secret memory of kindness from the enemy, of bread shared without suspicion, of guards who smiled instead of sneered. Some would later speak of it in hushed tones, long after Japan rebuilt itself. A few even wrote memoirs in the 1950s and 60s, though they were largely ignored. They spoke not of defeat, but of discovery, that the humanity of the enemy had given them back their own. In the eyes of those women, the American prison camps were not just places of survival. They were the first places in years where life felt worth living again. Time has blurred those memories, but the accounts remain. The Japanese women who once trembled at the sight of an American flag came to associate it with safety, with food, with dignity. Their stories remind us that even in the most brutal conflicts, compassion can become its own form of victory, a quiet triumph that outlasts any battle or bomb. By the summer of 1945, Japan was no longer an empire of expansion. It was an empire in ruins. Its cities had turned to ash, its skies blackened by American bombers, and its people, once filled with fanatical resolve, were now trapped in silence and starvation. Yet, even as defeat loomed inevitable, orders continued to pour across the Pacific, commanding nurses, clerks, and civilian women to remain with the troops in occupied territories. On islands like Saipan, Guam, and the Philippines, these women worked in makeshift hospitals, tending to the wounded, cooking for soldiers, and writing final letters for men who would never return home. Many were young, barely 20, some even teenagers, raised under the imperial doctrine that death was preferable to surrender. When the tide of war turned against Japan, their destiny changed forever. They had been told by their officers that the Americans were monsters, barbaric conquerors who would torture and violate any Japanese prisoner, especially women. Surrender, they were warned, was not an option. In training, they recited the code of Bushido, the samurai oath that forbade dishonor. To die for the emperor is to live forever, their instructors told them. And so, when the Allied forces began their relentless advance across the Pacific, fear spread faster than gunfire. Entire garrisons prepared for mass suicides. Mothers clutched their children as grenades rolled between them. Nurses carried small vials of poison in their uniforms, given by their commanding officers, a final assurance that they would never be captured alive. The final days of the Pacific War were nothing short of chaos. On Saipan in 1944, Japanese propaganda had convinced both soldiers and civilians that the American invasion would bring unimaginable suffering. When the Marines came ashore, they found cliffs lined with desperate people jumping into the sea, their screams carried away by the wind. Yet among the devastation, a few survived. Women who had hesitated, who had been too weak, too scared, or simply too human to end their own lives. These women became some of the first Japanese female prisoners of war, though they could hardly comprehend what that meant. Weak from hunger, half conscious from exhaustion, they were dragged from caves and rubble by American soldiers who offered water instead of bullets. For the Americans, the discovery of Japanese women among the prisoners was a shock. They had been trained to expect fierce, suicidal resistance. Instead, they found frightened nurses and clerks with trembling hands and hollow eyes. Some clung to photos of the emperor. Others whispered prayers for forgiveness, believing they had shamed their families by being captured. The Marines treated them carefully, unsure whether they were victims or enemies. They offered food, medical care, and shelter. For the women, every act of kindness was confusing, almost terrifying. One young nurse later wrote that she thought the chocolate given to her by a Marine was poisoned. She had never seen such generosity from a man holding a weapon. Across the Pacific, similar scenes unfolded as Japan's defensive line crumbled. In the Philippines, Burma, and New Guinea, Japanese units found themselves surrounded and outnumbered. When the war finally ended in August 1945, thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians, including women, were scattered across the Pacific Islands and Asian territories. Many were captured by American, British, and Australian forces. For female prisoners, the shame was unbearable. They had failed the emperor, failed their homeland, and most painfully, failed their own belief in honor. They were certain they would be punished, perhaps executed, by their captors. Instead, what awaited them was an unexpected silence. No shouts, no cruelty, no mockery. Just the distant hum of trucks, the clatter of metal mess kits, and the strange smell of coffee. They were processed, fed, and separated from male prisoners. They were treated by doctors and given clean uniforms. Some cried quietly, not from pain, but from disbelief. Their entire lives, they had been told that Americans were demons who would show no mercy. But in those first days of captivity, as they lay on cots under canvas tents, listening to the calm voices of American medics, the foundations of everything they believed began to crack. The collapse of Japan's empire did not just mark the end of a war. It shattered an entire worldview. The captured women, who had grown up in a society that demanded absolute obedience, suddenly found themselves in the care of an enemy who treated them as human beings. The contrast was unbearable yet liberating. Their capture, which should have been a moment of ultimate disgrace, became the beginning of something unexpected, a realization that compassion could exist even in the shadow of war. And though they did not yet understand it, these women were about to step into a world that would forever change how they saw their enemy, their country, and themselves. The first nights inside the American prison camps were filled with uncertainty. The women lay awake, unable to sleep, listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of the enemy's camp life. The murmur of English words, the clink of utensils, the low hum of engines. They expected at any moment to be dragged out, humiliated, or worse. But morning came quietly. The guards, young Americans barely older than their captives, handed out food and water with calm efficiency. There were no kicks, no shouting, no insults. Instead, they heard phrases like, "Good morning," and "You're safe now." Words that sounded foreign, even impossible. The women exchanged nervous glances, wondering if it was all a trick. The first meal was unforgettable. Many had not eaten properly in weeks. The war had starved them down to little more than bone and fear. But now, trays of rice, bread, and meat were handed to them. One woman later said she cried into her food because she couldn't understand why her enemy would feed her better than her own army had. When she was offered milk, she refused at first, convinced it was poisoned. But as the Americans sat nearby eating the same food, smiling as if this were ordinary life, she realized there was no deceit. For the first time in years, she ate until she was full. The humane treatment extended beyond food. American medics examined each prisoner, cleaning wounds and checking for infections. The Japanese women, accustomed to the rough authority of their own officers, were startled by the gentleness of these strangers. When a nurse bandaged the burned arm of one prisoner, she whispered, "You'll be okay now." The prisoner could only nod, unable to speak through tears. She later said she had never been touched with kindness during the entire war. To her, it was as if she had woken from a nightmare into a world she didn't recognize. The shock deepened when the women were given soap, clothes, and a chance to bathe. In Japan's collapsing empire, even soldiers had gone months without hygiene or dignity. Here, they were told to clean themselves, to rest, to recover. For those who had lived in filth and fear, this simple act of being told to wash was like being reminded they were human again. In their culture, where purity and honor had been intertwined, this gesture carried deep meaning. They were not being punished, they were being restored. But the emotional confusion ran deep. These women had been told since childhood that Americans were ruthless conquerors, devoid of morality. They had grown up on propaganda films showing Americans as beasts who burned villages and murdered civilians. To experience the opposite, a smile, a helping hand, a shared cigarette, was like standing on a battlefield where every belief had been shattered. One woman described it later. The enemy I feared was gone. In his place stood a man with eyes full of pity. Over time, the disbelief began to fade, replaced by quiet gratitude. They started to learn small English words, exchanging them shyly with their guards. "Thank you" was one of the first phrases many learned, spoken awkwardly but sincerely. Some American soldiers taught them card games or shared photographs of their families back home. The women, who had been taught that emotion was weakness, found themselves smiling for the first time in years. It felt strange, almost disloyal, to feel warmth toward the enemy, but they could not help it. The camps were not luxurious, but compared to the horrors they had escaped, bombed hospitals, starvation, suicide orders, they were sanctuaries. The women noticed the orderliness, the discipline, the calm tone of command. American officers insisted on rules, but they were enforced with reason, not rage. They saw that soldiers saluted superiors out of duty, not fear. For many Japanese women raised in a rigid hierarchy, this was astonishing. It revealed a kind of strength they had never known. A strength rooted in humanity rather than intimidation. At night, the sound of music drifted from the guard tents. Jazz, harmonicas, or sometimes quiet humming filled the humid air. The women listened in silence, lying under rough canvas roofs, unsure whether to weep or smile. The war had taken everything from them. Homes, families, faith. But here, amidst their captors, they heard something that felt like life returning. It was, one recalled, as if the world had begun again, and we were hearing its heartbeat. In those first weeks, the American prison camps transformed from places of fear into places of awakening. The women who had entered them expecting cruelty found instead a kind of mercy they had never imagined possible. For the first time since the war began, they began to dream, not of victory or loyalty, but of survival, of peace, of the simple chance to live without fear. And though they could not yet say it aloud, many began to believe that perhaps the true difference between conqueror and captive was not in strength, but in compassion. Days in the camp began with the rising sun spilling across rows of white tents and wooden barracks. The morning air carried the faint scent of soap and rice, and for the first time in years, there was no sound of sirens or bombs. For the Japanese women, this calm was unsettling. They woke each day expecting the peace to vanish, convinced that this kindness could not last. But as days turned to weeks, they began to accept the rhythm of this new life, a life of structure, nourishment, and quiet. The American soldiers were no longer shadows of fear. They had faces, names, and gestures that spoke of decency rather than dominance. The women learned to work again, though this time not under the lash of military command, but with a strange sense of purpose. Some were assigned to the camp kitchens, helping to cook meals alongside allied cooks. Others tended to gardens planted within the camp fences, growing vegetables that reminded them of home. For many, these gardens became sacred spaces, a small piece of Japan amid foreign soil. They watered the plants carefully, whispering to them as though tending to their own lost pasts. Every sprout was a reminder that life, fragile as it was, could return even after destruction. Emotionally, the transformation was slower. Many remained haunted by guilt. Guilt for surviving when others had died, guilt for being treated well by the enemy, guilt for beginning to feel gratitude. They still bowed toward the east during sunrise, murmuring apologies to the emperor for their dishonor. Yet, even those prayers began to change. The women no longer prayed for death, they prayed for forgiveness and strength. American guards who observed this did not interrupt. They gave them space, recognizing that faith, even in the enemy, was a kind of healing. Over time, language barriers began to dissolve. A few of the women who spoke broken English helped translate, becoming bridges between captor and captive. Through them, the women learned that many American soldiers had left families behind. Wives, sisters, mothers waiting for their return. That realization softened something deep within. They began to see their captors not as symbols of conquest, but as sons and brothers caught in the same storm of war. One young woman, once terrified of speaking, began to share her story with an American nurse. The nurse listened, offered her tea, and placed a gentle hand on hers. It was the first time she felt truly seen as a person rather than a soldier of a defeated empire. The camp soon developed a fragile sense of community. There were laughter and conversation, shared moments of humanity that transcended uniform and language. Some of the women helped in the infirmary, tending to both Japanese and Allied wounded. Their training as nurses, once used in the service of war, now became an act of peace. They cleaned wounds, changed bandages, and sometimes even sang softly to the injured men. The irony was not lost on them. Once enemies, now healers. It was in those acts of care that many began to reclaim their sense of purpose, one not defined by loyalty to a flag, but by compassion for life itself. Evenings in the camp were quiet. The guards allowed the women to gather near the fence and watch the sunset. The sky would fade from orange to deep blue, and for a few moments, the war seemed like a distant memory. Some spoke of home, others of dreams they once had before the empire demanded everything. There was sadness, but also a growing strength, a quiet determination to live, to remember, and to forgive. Healing, they realized, did not come through victory or obedience. It came through the slow, gentle rediscovery of what it meant to be human again. The difference between American prison camps and Japanese ones could not have been more profound. In the Pacific, tales of Japanese cruelty had become infamous. The starvation of Allied POWs, the brutal marches, the disregard for human life. The Imperial Army viewed surrender as shameful, and thus treated prisoners as less than human. They were laborers, expendable and forgotten. But when the war turned, and Japanese soldiers and civilians found themselves in enemy hands, the Americans made a deliberate choice to be the opposite of what they had suffered. Their prison camps were built not only on military order, but on moral principle. For American commanders, adhering to the Geneva Conventions was not just strategy, it was a statement of civilization. They wanted to prove that democracy, even in war, was stronger than the tyranny that sought to destroy it, and so, Japanese prisoners were treated with fairness, discipline, and unexpected compassion. The women in particular were given special protection, not out of pity, but out of respect for their vulnerability in defeat. Their captors were soldiers, but they were also human beings who had seen too much death. They understood that mercy was not weakness. It was a reflection of victory's humanity. The Japanese women could not help but compare this to their own experiences under the imperial system. They remembered the cruelty of their superiors, the cold indifference of officers who had viewed them as tools of war. They had seen Allied prisoners beaten, humiliated, and starved under Japanese command. Some of them had even tended to these prisoners, their hearts breaking silently as they were ordered to obey. Now, in the hands of the enemy, they were treated with the very dignity their own army had denied others. The irony was unbearable. It forced them to confront a painful truth, that the empire they had served in devotion had betrayed its own ideals of honor. Among the American ranks, stories spread of the women who bowed deeply before their captors, whispering thanks in broken English. To the soldiers, it was disarming. They had been told to expect hatred, but instead they found humility. Many guards wrote home, describing their admiration for the Japanese women's resilience, their politeness even in defeat. What neither side fully understood was that these simple gestures, acts of kindness and gratitude, were more powerful than any weapon used in the war. They restored fragments of humanity in a world that had nearly lost it. This moral contrast did not go unnoticed by historians and observers after the war. Reports noted the discipline and cleanliness of American-run camps, the efforts to maintain decency even amid chaos. The Japanese prisoners, accustomed to military brutality, were stunned by this restraint. Some even refused to believe it at first, insisting it was an illusion meant to weaken their spirit. But as weeks passed, the truth became undeniable. They were being treated as equals in defeat, not as animals. In that quiet revelation, the women began to question the very foundation of the imperial doctrine. They wondered why their nation had demanded such suffering, why mercy had been painted as weakness, and why compassion had been erased from their understanding of war. The contrast between cruelty and kindness became a mirror in which they saw their own humanity reflected back, shattered, but not lost. For the Americans, it was proof that moral strength could outlast the brutality of conquest. And for the Japanese women, it was the beginning of redemption, not for their empire, but for their own hearts. When the war finally ended, the world moved on quickly. Cities were rebuilt, governments rose from ruins, and history books were written by the victors. Yet, for the Japanese women who had lived within those prison camps, the memory of captivity remained quietly luminous. A paradox of pain and grace. In their letters and recollections, they rarely spoke of war's violence. Instead, they spoke of bread, music, medicine, and the strange kindness of those they had once feared. They remembered the way the American guards greeted them with respect, the way they were allowed to live with dignity when they expected only death. These memories did not fade. They became symbols of something larger, a proof that even in humanity's darkest moments, compassion could survive. After their release, many of the women struggled to reintegrate into Japanese society. They returned to a homeland still covered in ash and shame. Food was scarce, the economy destroyed, and the stigma of surrender hung over them like a shadow. In the eyes of many, they were disgraced, not heroes, not martyrs, but reminders of defeat. Few spoke of their experiences publicly. To admit that they had been treated well by the enemy was considered betrayal. Yet, in private, among trusted friends or family, they spoke with quiet reverence about their time in captivity. They called the camps a paradise, not because they were free, but because they had rediscovered kindness in a world that had forgotten it. Some of the women later wrote memoirs, small self-published volumes that rarely reached beyond Japan. In their words, readers could sense a deep conflict, gratitude toward their captors, sorrow for their homeland, and confusion about what the war had truly meant. They spoke of the moral awakening that came from defeat, of the painful realization that mercy could be stronger than obedience. Their stories were not of vengeance, but of transformation. One woman wrote, "They took our freedom, but gave us back our souls. In America, a few soldiers who had guarded the camps also remembered those women. Decades later, veterans' letters revealed that they never forgot the Japanese nurses and civilians they had once protected. They described their respect for their grace, their discipline, their quiet dignity. Some even corresponded through Red Cross letters long after the war, exchanging photos and brief notes of peace. These unlikely friendships stood as silent memorials to a truth that transcended nations, that compassion leaves a deeper mark than conquest. In the decades that followed, historians began to re-examine the nature of captivity and morality in war. The story of the Japanese female POWs became a rare example of reconciliation, born not from treaties or politics, but from simple acts of human decency. It was a reminder that victory is not only measured by battles won, but by the mercy shown when power could have been abused. The women, who once feared death at the hands of their captors, carried into their old age the memory of warmth and humanity given to them in their darkest hour. Even now, long after the guns have fallen silent, their legacy endures. It lives in the understanding that the true measure of civilization is not how fiercely it fights, but how gently it treats the defeated. The American camps, remembered by their captives as paradise, became proof that compassion can exist even amid ruins. And in the quiet hearts of the women who once bowed before the enemy, that compassion became a light that outshone the fire of war itself.